Hello everyone. In this tutorial, we are going to learn about Azure Functions. Azure Function is again a platform as a service offering provided by Microsoft Azure. Azure Function can be think as a method or a function which you write in any of the language. It should be short executable code to perform an specific task, such as an method to send an email, method to send a notification, or a function to execute some logic based on some events. For an example, online shopping website, somebody performs a shopping activity, creates an order. Once an order is received, or notification is received, and let's say a service was queue, a message gets triggered by Azure function, and Azure function responds to that particular message and send the order notification email to the customer or to the vendor that you need to ship the order which has been received by this and this customer. Or Azure function can call another function which might send the labeling information about your packaging of the order. So there are various scenarios in which you can create the Azure functions. So here in this tutorial, what we are going to do, we are going to use the Azure functions as an offering, and the good thing here is I'm not going to use Visual Studio to create Azure function. As Microsoft Azure is moving towards the open source platform, more and more feature is being added to Visual Studio Code. And now here in this tutorial, I'm going to use my Mac machine and Visual Studio Code to build Azure function from my Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to deploy it to the Azure. So let's look at that. How do we do that? As you can see, I have Visual Studio Code open on my machine, and I have one folder already open for you which is empty at the moment, just to start the demonstration. First of all, on your Visual Studio Code, you need a couple of extensions. If you are creating Azure functions on a C Sharp, then obviously you need a C Sharp extension on your Mac machine or on your Visual Studio Code in Windows as well. So I've already installed the C Sharp extension, which is this one. So you should be installing this as well if you are performing or developing a Azure function on C Sharp. If it's not necessary to create Azure function on C Sharp, it also offers variety of languages such as PHP, .NET, .NET Core, Java, Ruby, Python, the same set of language which it offers for app services. For now, I'm more comfortable with C Sharp, so I'll go ahead and create Azure function in C Sharp. So as I mentioned, I have already installed this extension, and on top of that, you need to install Azure extension as well. So this is the extension which you need to create the Azure functions and the other Azure services which are listed down here. I'll go and click on my Azure services. So what it will do, it will ask you to log in to your Azure account, sign into your Azure account if you have not already done. I have already signed in to my Azure account. That's why I don't need, it's not asking me to sign in. Now you can see you have a various option to create the app services, Azure functions, resource group, storage account, and others. So you can go ahead and choose your type of service and created directly from Visual Studio Code, which is really cool feature I really like about it. You don't need to install 10 GB or 12 GB of Visual Studio Code setup, which is more of specific to Windows machines only, and it takes hell lot of space on your machine. So here I've just installed this setup and it's doing the same work which it used to do for me. And for Azure Function, I don't need anything else apart from these things. So let's go ahead and create new Azure Function. So click on the Azure Function plus icon or create new project first of all. I would rather go ahead and create new project. It is asking me choose the Azure Function project. Where do you want to create a new function? I'm going to use the same folder which I have already opened. Now, next thing, it is asking to choose the type of language you want to use. So as I mentioned, I'm going to use the C# as a language, but you can go ahead and choose the other language such as JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Java, and PowerShell as well. Once you have selected the language, next thing it asks to select the type of Azure function which you want to create. So at the moment, Azure offers variety of different type of Azure functions such as blob trigger, which executes when some events happens to your Azure blob storage, such as if somebody add a file to the blob storage, then if your Azure function listens to that event, then the Azure function will trigger. Cosmos DB, when some document or record is modified on your Cosmos DB, then you can use the Azure function to listen to that particular event. Again, there are other options such as Durable function, Event Hub, IoT, Queue Trigger. Again, if you want to create Azure function which is on the event of a queue message, which is a storage bus queue, I believe, and also on the service bus queue and the topic as well. You can also create the Azure function on a time trigger as well. Now, I'm going to create a Azure function based on the HTTP trigger. So let's choose the HTTP trigger. Next thing, it is asking you to give an appropriate name to your Azure function. I will call it as an GitHub notification. This is the name of my Azure function. Next, it's asking you to choose the notification, the namespace for your Azure function. So let's say I'm going to call learning Azure function. That's it. Now, one more thing it is asking is about the access right settings. So Azure Function offers three types of access right: functions, anonymous, and admin. When you choose the functions type of access setting, it means you would be able to execute the HTTP access type of functions only if you have the URL and the access key linked with URL. The access key format would be like similar to the access key which you get in, let's say, storage account access key or app registration access key or any other different type of access key which usually Microsoft Azure follows. So you need to have the entire connection string, as access key is basically going to provide a security layer to invoke your Azure function. Second type is anonymous type. Let's say if you want to in, give a freedom to anybody to invoke your Azure function, then you can go ahead and choose the anonymous type of Azure function to create. Third, And the last one is the admin access, which could be the higher level of permission which administrator will have to invoke your HTTP function. For now, I'm going to choose Azure Function with the function access rights. And you can see at the taskbar, my function is getting created, and I got the project created now. And if I look at the code now, I got the Azure Function CS project created, one CS file created, and the local host and settings file as well. The good thing about the Azure Function now, with the help of Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio even in 2019, you can invoke Azure Function locally on your machine. You don't need to deploy, even though if you want to debug it without deploying Azure Function, you can do it right away from your code. That's a good thing, which was not possible in the earlier version of Visual Studio. Let's look at the definition of Visual Studio of your Azure function. Here you can see the name of my Azure function and the function name which will be displayed when I deploy my Azure function. And you can see as the definition of the service, function is nothing just a type of method which it is going to invoke. Now I can go ahead and add a reference to any of the DLL inside this logic which can refer to and perform the other task. As you can see, the definition itself, it is HTTP trigger type and which is listening to get and post method both. Here we are looking for the query parameter and the parameter name is name. So whatever value we have in the name query parameter, we are reading the value out of it and we are displaying it here in a result, and it will return the result here. So let's see if we are able to build and run our Azure function from the Visual Studio Code. So far so good. We are able to create a Azure function on our Visual Studio Code right away. If you look at the code here, you have the Azure functions built in. I, I already have one Azure function created on my Azure account. Let's not look at right now. At the moment, it's the Azure function. When I'm going to run it, it's going to use my local emulator for the storage account. One thing to tell you, Azure functions always requires storage account as a backbone to read and write all the logs which is going to capture during the runtime. So all the monitoring it is performing, basically it is going to keep into the storage account. So for now, before I deploy the code, I'm using my local emulator to keep all those logs. Let's run the function by pressing F5. As you can see, my function is running locally right here on my Visual Studio Code, and it's listening for an event here. If I go ahead and click on the Azure function, I should be able to get the notification. As you can see, I got the default notification. Now, if I go and check, pass on the information such as in the name. So I'm expecting the name to be returned by the Azure function, and I'm also expecting the information around the logs into the Azure function. Let's see that. As you can see, the information has been sent back by the Azure function and my name gets displayed. I'll go and check what is the information available here. As you can see, the status code which I have received is type of 200, which is what I am expecting. So now next thing what you can do here is, let me stop the function. Let's say if you don't have the Azure function created on your Azure subscription, then you can go ahead and create the Azure function right away from here. If you click here, create Azure function, and then it will ask you to create a function. Next thing is about the deployment. You can go ahead and click on the deployment. It's a really good feature that you can deploy the Azure function right away from here. I'll walk you through about the Azure functions, some of the basic things. Here is my Azure function looks like. When you deploy the Azure function, you can have the detail of your function listed down here. All the configuration settings like you see in your app settings, everything you would be able to see it here. You can scale up and scale down based on the app service plan which you are working on or which you have chosen for your Azure function. So based on that, you can scale up and scale down to your Azure function. You can trigger Azure function locally right away from here. Let's go ahead and deploy the function directly from here. So for this demonstration, I'm directly going to go ahead and deploy the Azure function to the existing Azure function. Deploy my code to the existing Azure function. As you can see in the terminal, the deployment is getting started. The project is compiled and now it is ready for the deployment. So currently it is running the deployment on this function. You can see here all the functions will be listed down here. The Azure function would be available after the deployment. As per this, the notification by deployment to the Azure function is completed. Let's look at that now. It might take a while to refresh it here. Meanwhile, we'll go ahead and check here on the portal if it's deployed. Yeah, my Azure function, you can see the deployment is getting successfully completed. So now I have my Azure function deployed successfully. I can go ahead and anytime copy the URL. Copy the URL. As I mentioned, the URL contains the name of your Azure functions, https azurewebsite.net, and then API, the name of Azure function, and the code. Code block ends with double equals, which is the key of the Azure function. So anybody who is calling the Azure function, they need to have this key. What we can do is I can go to the GitHub, go to my repository, and what I'm going to do now here, I'm going to create a webhook event with the use of my Azure function. So here, this is the function URL. I'm going to choose application JSON, which is the type of data. And by default, you see the type of event trigger which this web is looking for is the just push event. But if you want, you can anytime go ahead and choose the different type of events. Let's leave the default event as a push by default. I just want to make a push and just want to check if the Azure function is getting executed. As you can see, the current Azure function webhook is showing as an gray icon, which shows that with the help of tooltip, This hook is never been triggered. Let's trigger this now. To do, I'm going to make changes to my GitHub repository. Hopefully, this should invoke the webhook, and my webhook should have the event. As you can see now, I have the event successfully captured. If I go here, I should have the event logged in the recent deliveries. I can go ahead and check the data of the event. You can see this is the payload which has been passed. So in my logic, what I can do is I can deserialize this request in my logic with the help of JSON, Newton's of JSON, and use any of these properties such as avatar or the name of the repository or type of check-in or who has checked in, something like that. And based on that, I can send a notification, email notification, or perform some actions based on this notification. And then this is what I can do with the help of HTTP trigger with webhook. And this is just not only for the webhook to the external service, but if you want, you can go ahead and perform the webhook kind of event here in your application as well. If you look at the Azure function now, you have successfully received the event here as well. If I go to the event, I need to go and check in the application inside queries. But you get the idea how it has been logging all the events. One more thing for a developers to know, you can always go ahead and run your Azure function locally from here. For example, I can pass the name like this. I'm expecting the result to be retrieved as is. The function is triggered successfully. Now let's look at some of the other settings in Azure Function. Here I can specify the application configuration settings. If I'm reading any secrets from the key vault, then I can specify the key vault URL of my secret here in this configuration. I want to specify any other type of configuration which is bound to my Azure Function logic. I can specify here. There is a general settings which is available, which is specific to the type of framework which we are using it. I can anytime go and change the settings as well. You can set the manage identity if you wish to. We'll take a look at the manage identity feature sometime in future video. If I go to the app service plan and check out the number of apps, you should be able to see I have Azure function inside my app service plan. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching that.